Welcome to the Learning to Die podcast.
I'm Ian Dunican.
And I'm Ciaran O'Regan.
How do I live when I know I must die?
We explore areas of philosophy, psychology, martial arts, culture, existential risk, history, society, religion, science, and anything else that seems of interest and relevance to answering that question.
We can only hope that some of what we learn might be of benefit to you too. Namaste, sapiens. And we'll just jump in anywhere, because as always, Ciaran, we talk before the podcast and then we have a podcast before the podcast and we miss out on heaps of stuff. So today's topic was going to be on Christianity and society, and today's really kind of a scoping review, we were calling this one, Ciaran, where we're going to jump into a few new topics in a few different areas, because we've been doing some tangential reading on this. So yeah, so where do you want to start, my friend?
I suppose this is the scope and review that we're trying to have a look at. Is I think we both, with our interests in philosophy, for so long, and maybe is influenced by having read similar things and been chatting, but we both ended up developing a real interest in, a curiosity in Christianity as it relates from multiple directions, but in particular, how it relates to the structure of our society and civilization in the Western world and the role that it's played. And in particular, I know we've been chatting. I'd sent you some stuff from Tom Holland, and I'm reading his book at the minute, Dominion, which yeah. It's an unreal piece of work. It's absolutely savage. It's massive, though. I ended up reading like the last third of it first, from the Enlightenment onwards. And then
it's broken into sections, is it? Like it's like you can actually delve into the sections, can you?
Yeah. He's got like a chapter called Science, for example, and the last chapter is called Woke. So I ended up reading that from like the Enlightenment onwards, but I ended up going back to the start and reading it. But it's big. It's like a 500-page book. It's very big, but it's really good. And his kind of premise is that we're like goldfish in a bowl that don't realize we're swimming in Christian water. Is the premise. We don't realize what we're swimming in. That because we're so imbibed and surrounded by, and our culture is so drenched in Christianity, that we don't even realize that that's what's going on. It's like it's so taken for granted, so much of these values. He even uses examples like the word religion, like the notion that religion is something that could be separate from the state, or the fact that the notion that religion is something that people do that do privately or do on weekends or do as something separate to their everyday lives. That in itself, he says, is like, that's a profoundly Christian concept. And whereas in all the other societies that he's referencing, it's thoroughly imbibed throughout the entirety of the culture. And it's part of the governmental structures, and it's part of, whereas this notion that, like, that the Christian notion of render unto to God what is God's and unto Caesar what is Caesar's, the separation of church and state, that notion is profoundly Christian notion. The fact that there could be a secular civilization is profoundly Christian in its origins, for example. Another one then would be, which something we might end up talking about, is like the foundation of human rights, and the notion that all humans come from the same place and are all, as a result, created equally in this notion. Like the human rights can't exist without that, because otherwise what is there? And it was actually, he references in the particular, he talks a lot about slavery in it. And one of I think the phrase crime against humanity was used by, I think it might have been like a Quaker lawyer in the mid 1800s for the first time ever, because they were trying to come up with a phrase that Christians could accept, but also non-Christians, because they were trying to create but it was Quaker Christians that drove the anti-slavery movement. And the seeds of that were set by this notion that all humans were created equal. And but then there was a whole lot of other things went on historically that he doesn't write about that I've come across, but there was arguments over things like polygenesis and monogenesis, where do all humans come from the same Adam and Eve, let's say, or was there Adam and Eves from all over the place, like Indian Adam and Eves and African Adam and Eves and so on and so on. But once there was a kind of a clarity that humans had all come from the same place, that there was a monogenesis of humanity, that we all came from the same source, that then in conjunction with this notion, the Christian notion that all humans, to use Christian language, are created equal in the eyes of God, it then becomes kind of untenable to facilitate things like slavery, to facilitate barbarisms, to facilitate unwarranted wars of any form, because or take it, because then you're committing a crime against the creator of the universe. Whereas before, other religious how would you put it, like traditions don't necessarily have that same focus. So there's a load of angles we could go at. But I think
let me pick on one there, Ciaran, because this is interesting. Because obviously you and I both being Irish, the Catholic Church was very much involved. Obviously, the Catholic Church being a Christian organization, very much involved in the state in Ireland. So if I'm reading what you're saying there is correct, as in, religion and the state can be separate. There's two things there. One is that obviously in countries like Ireland for so long, it wasn't separate, it was intertwined. Then the second thing is, if a church and a state break away or have separate things, but if they're both swimming in the same water, to use the analogy as you had a moment ago, is there really a separation between church and state in any shape, way or form in a Christian society? Like, are you separating in name? Is it a bit like getting divorced but living in the same house?
That's a really good. See, I don't know enough about the legal structures or the structure of the formation of the Irish government, the Irish state, other than, of course, I know that Catholicism would have had a massive influence on De Valera, and he would have been influenced in developing the Constitution, etc., by some major figures in the Catholic Church in Ireland. But at the same time, those influences, and while there would have been Catholic influences in the development of the kind of the moral structure or the kind of guidelines, because that's the thing, is that humans aren't, we're not automatons or robots, and we all have biases, and we all have values, and the values do get built into government structures. But I suppose the difference is there isn't an official seat in Parliament or the Dáil for the Bishop of Dublin. No, so like there isn't an official place. So like the influence would have been there, but the influence would have been by the Catholic Church having an influence in conversation or in letter with politicians, not having an official role in government. Where there was, as I said, like where you'd have a council of bishops that have an influence over the structure of the government. Whereas if you look at something like Iran, it's a religious leader that runs Iran. Like the Ayatollahs, or you look at a country like, obviously another one would be Saudi, where they impact variants of Sharia law. So it's Islamic law that runs the country, and they don't have the capacity, and its religious leaders have a very strong influence over there. So but Iran is probably a better example, because it's this religious leader specifically involved in running the government, even though they have what is kind of like, my understanding, a kind of a parliament council thing, but it's nowhere near what we'd have in Western countries in terms of the power that you'd see elected officials having. So that's at the same time, the values themselves of Western liberal democracy. So if you look at something like even to consider the notion of a liberal democracy in which each individual is officially, at least, this is taking human value and bias out of it, just individual bias. Each individual in a liberal democracy is seen as having equal intrinsic worth. That in itself is a profoundly kind of Christian notion, in terms of, it's like men and women get, even though there would have been a differentiation in early on and way back at the start in Christianity, where women were seen to be subordinate to men, of course, but that becomes untenable. Like it sowed the seeds of its own undermining by basically saying all people are created, all men are created equal. They use the word men, of course, but that notion sowed the seeds of its own undermining, such that you eventually ended up with, as economic systems and everything change, all of a sudden you end up with a scenario where feminism can arise out of a system like that, or civil rights movements in the US. And even though there was slavery specifically mentioned in the Bible, you end up with as soon as you have all men are created equal, you have which is obviously the American Constitution. It sows the seed, which is based on a Christian notion of universal brotherhood. It sows the seeds of its own undermining, its own internal revolution. So just the notion that each person has some inherent intrinsic worth, and that everyone is the same in the eyes of the Creator, that kind of notion is what's needed in order to have a society where you have a democracy, not like the ancient Greek style democracy where only the men who were citizens got a chance to vote, but where everyone gets a vote. Like that's because the word democracy comes from like the Greek word, the rule of the people, but the difference was the demos at that point was basically the citizenry of Greece, which were just basically the male maybe landowners or the male patrons of Greek citizens, but not the women. The women ran religious institutions and not institutions, but religious ceremonies in the churches, etc., the temples. But this notion of how you put it, like universal brotherhood, and then that then sows the seeds for universal brother and sisterhood. You know what I mean? And then that creates the soil from which we can have a scenario where everyone in society gets a vote, no matter what, and everyone can run for politics, no matter what. So unless they have certain exclusions, like for.
Yeah, so I like your example. I like your clarification of the difference between like religious leaders running a state and that separation between church and state. And then, maybe we do have this kind of by osmosis in a Christian society. Those values do seep into our culture in every shape, way, or form. Whether it be Christianity or Islam or Buddhism or whatever it might be, because depending on the country, if the majority of your population is that specific religion, then you're going to have those ethics and values seep in. Like Ireland was always like 97-98% Catholic, for example, in the Republic. So therefore, it would be thought that would be the case. If you went to somewhere like Thailand, where people are probably 95% Buddhist, then you're going to have very much a Buddhist philosophy and a Buddhist ethics and values into the government system as well. But what you said there, Ciaran, about being very Christian in terms of like everybody being equal and everybody having a voice and everybody having intrinsic worth, that is a really interesting statement around everybody's worth, regardless of IQ or capability or physical attributes or male or female or whatever it might be. It feels very inclusive. And when you were saying that, it rings the bells of socialism and Marxism for me in terms of everybody having equality. Why do you think then that Marxism and communism and sort of socialism was so far away from Christianity, when really they probably could have integrated with Christianity to use as a vehicle maybe to go forward? Because it seems like the language is so similar, but they were very anti-Christianity, as we saw in Russia, where Christian orthodoxy was basically driven underground in the communist era. And again, I don't know much about that, but from what I've read, it's basically been driven under, and people practiced in secret or got baptized in secret, really. So why wouldn't Marxism and communism, do you think, maybe not be part of that?
Well, first, there's the different angles. So there were, to my knowledge, Christian socialists around in the 19th century, that had that kind of notion of, but not Marxist style, like Marxist style socialism, like socialism as a movement and all the load of different flavors of it arose in response to the horrors of the Industrial Revolution, in terms of the dislodging of loads of people, the destruction of the uprooting of families and shifting, huge families into urban areas and uprooting communities and all these kind of things that were taking place that were kind of uneasy. There was a kind of all different forms of socialism that were coming around. But I suppose Marxism is, he would have been very atheistic, but his ideology was in itself in some way kind of like a version of Christianity without any love or forgiveness or any kind of metaphysical root that was Christian, other than he had a similar narrative of, it was like I wouldn't be the first one to point out that he had kind of like a rapture ideology, in terms of like, when this happens, then utopia. So it's like this notion of, we're all weak, we're all equal, and we're all oppressed by these bad guys, and then when we get this, then utopia is going to happen. It's like, that wasn't exactly said it. He was obviously, what he was saying was way higher resolution, and his critiques of, he had a load of really astute critiques of capitalism, and that were on the money, a lot of the critiques, but obviously like the point that the pointers at solutions didn't work out great. Obviously, tens of millions of people dying of starvation and gulags, etc. But this notion that when we do X, then it was like orientating toward utopia. It was orientating toward paradise. It was orientating toward a kind of a return to the Garden of Eden, and so I don't know. Part of it, you can see then how that kind of crack doesn't link up with the church, is that he would have been obsessed with power and who had the power. And when you saw the role that the church had in Europe and in Russia, at the Orthodox Church in Russia, and then in Russia, in terms of in Europe, is obviously Marx was German, and it just ended up gaining legs with Lenin, etc. And after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. But you look at the power that the Catholic Church had, and you look at all the historical uses of the power that it had that were atrocious. Things like the Crusades, or the fucking Spanish Inquisitions and witch huntings and all this kind of crack that went on. The notion that he had was like, this religion is kind of the opium of the people, and it's like a tool of control, a tool of power. So that's kind of antithetical to this notion where, like, from anything I know about Marx, I don't think his objective was Maoism. Like, his objective was, it was in the lines of, I don't think he ever really clearly plotted out what's going to happen after the revolution, but it was along the lines of, there's dismantle capitalism, and that's on the way toward a kind of an anarchism. But it was ended up being the institutional application of power by those who took over the revolution, who did the revolution, in Russia's case, the Leninists, or in China's case, the Mao and his lads, that it was there ended up becoming a government structure that was not removable, that had a utopian ideology, that then led to this kind of like purification based on the ideology, because the ideology was utopian, which as soon as the ideology couldn't expand beyond its borders, or turned in on top of itself and started purifying, essentially, to use Nazi language. The Nazi ideology was a socialist ideology as well. Like, you have to remember that Nazism was this. They're called the Nazis, but that's because the German name for the party was the Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, which means like the German National Workers Socialist Party. So it's like, the Nazism is thought of as like far right, but it was a left party in their ideology. It just so happened that their version of socialism was not inclusive. It was particularly exclusive of those who weren't in the type of people that they wanted to provide for. But if you were in the kind of elite group of what they were seen as like the Aryan race or whatever, then you were going to be grand. But if you weren't in that group, you're going to be eradicated. Was eventually what ended up happening. So I suppose I went in a bit of a ramble there, but you'd have to look at a kind of a historian of Marx and historian of the way communism turned out, but also a historian of 19th century forms of socialism to see that there was loads of different types of socialism that weren't just, the Marxism was like one strand. And that just so happened to be the one where that ended up gaining so much influence politically with the likes of Lenin and Mao, etc.
So let me ask you a kind of a big question, which
and there were Christian parts of it, you know.
Yeah. Let me ask you a big question, which is on our topic today about Christianity and society. Do you think now today, in today's world, Ciaran, if we say that, you know, if Jesus was around 2,000 years ago, roughly, and we talk about that as the Christian era being sort of ushered in, hence what we use Christian era and before Christian era. We have 2,000 years of it now, and I'm sure we're going to talk about Nietzsche today and about how God is dead and a few other things like that, and nihilistic approaches and postmodernism. Do you think that, you know, Christianity still has value in our society today, or has it got no value? Is it something worth pursuing, or is it completely dying or dead? And the reason I ask that question is because recently, this is what's kind of led me to this topic a little bit as well. And obviously we've been on kind of a few different paths lately. I was recently in Melbourne and I got to see my wife's auntie, who has been a Catholic nun for approximately 65 to 66 years. And she's in palliative care now. She's dying from cancer and she's probably got about 3 to 6 months to live. And I'll be seeing her in a few weeks, and she's actually agreed to do an hour podcast to talk about where she is in her life at the moment. But I had a very interesting conversation with her recently about God and about life and so on. And then I asked, even because she's in a convent, and I asked the other nuns there about how many nuns are joining, and we're like, lucky if we get one a year into our order. And so one of the most recent ones, I think, was an actual physician, a doctor who joined, and in her 30s. And I think there's 80 nuns over the age of 80. And it made me think about, like, is like Christianity dying, or is it dead, or is the Catholic Church dying or dead? And then I was reading about, like, some churches here in Perth will only get maybe 20 people at a mass, whereas when I was a kid in the 80s, there'd be standing room at the back, like the place would be packed. And I'm just wondering, like, how much does Christianity, and all forms of Christianity, not just Catholicism, obviously that's what I'm familiar with mostly, is it dying? Is it dead? Is it gone? And does it still have a part to play in our society?
I think the way you ended that, I think, is really important, where you said our society, because I think that first of all, I think it's really useful to differentiate what's happening in the Western world and what's happening around the world. So, like, Catholicism is growing massively in Africa, for example,
and South America and the Philippines, and Southeast Asia.
Yeah. So it's in the Western world. So, and this is part of what makes that book so interesting. The Dominion, or is it? I don't have the cover on it, but that fucking, look, see how thick it is. It's
Jesus
massive.
Christ! Between that and fucking Ian McGilchrist, we'll go blind reading, me and you.
Yeah,
those three books are about 3,000 pages between the three of them.
Yeah, no, it probably is, man. Like, that's 500-600 pages. Like, but and I've up there then have the genealogy of morals, because that's Nietzsche's critique of Christianity. But
I'll have to get, that's another one I'm gonna have to get. I'll be entombed in books.
Yeah, I've got some good genealogy of morals quotes here, and I've got one I want to read in a minute. That's from the Gay Science. It's the one where he announces the death of God in rather dramatic fashion. But so I think, see, it comes down to how you even, I think, define Christianity and how you think of it and how you begin to approach it, because so how I've been kind of thinking of it is, like, and I've gotten really interested in, like, the structures of the different types of Christianity and what it means, and the difference between this notion of, and I was influenced, of course, by Tolstoy in this, but the difference between imitating the core teachings of Christ and the difference between trying to do that in a way where you live in ways that are, like, orientated toward the betterment of others, and realizing that all people are are equal in terms of, even if you look at it in a kind of a new agey kind of a way, that we all come from the same capital S source of existence. If you don't want to use the word God, we are in the most fundamental scientific sense, we are all unfoldings of the same nature that all had the same source with a capital S, let's say.
Yeah.
And that whether that source was the Big Bang or whether that source was an infinitely recurring universe, or whether that's so it doesn't really, there was a source of existence, and whatever that source was, we are downstream of that, and we're all downstream of it, and we couldn't have been any differently over that timeline. Even if quantum randomness is a real thing and there's this lawless law at the bottom of physics that exists, it's still, there wasn't a choice of ours to be any different than we are. So basically this realization that we are all, as humans, unique unfoldings that are ever changing, that stem from the same source of reality, that in itself is like a non-religious, well, it's, I suppose it is religious, but it's a non-Christian way of putting that notion that we are all the same in the eyes of God.
That's kind of similar to what Spinoza said about, like, you know, about God being nature and we being part of nature as well. And that's what got Spinoza kicked out of the the Judean system, or Judean religion, because of that. And I think, I like Spinoza's stuff because it's very much along these lines that, God is nature. We are nature. We are God. That's what I get from reading Spinoza. That's what I always keep coming back to when I read anything about Spinoza.
Yeah.
And whilst his book, is it Ethics?
Ethics, yeah.
I was reading it when I was away. It's quite hard. I found it a bit difficult to read, but I was in a kind of a holiday mode as well. And I wasn't really in the mood probably for thinking that much, but I kept coming back to this kind of, nearly like a trinity in my head: God, nature, humans, and we are all interrelated. We are all the same thing. So, which then obviously reminds me of like the Indra's net in Buddhism about the reflection of the jewel in each and every, we're all kind of the same. So I think it's kind of interesting. I want to talk to my Auntie Mary about this. This is the language that she used, Ciaran. Like, she's within 3 to 6 months of passing on, and this is the language that she used as a Catholic nun. She very much spoke about this connectivity, about being so important and yet nothing at the same time. It was very Buddhist, Spinoza, Taoist. I feel very connected. She didn't talk about, an entity or a God sitting on a cloud looking down, doling out information and, oh yeah, Ciaran, you're going to get punished for that. Ian, yeah, you did well there, you got to get this. It wasn't this sort of a God. It was very much a kind of from what I interpret as a karmic or a energy God, or everything is heading in a certain way. Or the word that you use, which I really like, is this unique unfolding, which is really nice. And I think, that sort of thinking can be very helpful in understanding our purpose. And I think maybe it's independent of any religion. I think it's actually like an elective module for any religion, whether it be Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism. These things are for all, I think.
And I think there's a really interesting component there. You said is like, so this is something that McGilchrist, I think something you mentioned McGilchrist there earlier on, and I think an important thing that he emphasizes is the way that our brain has orientated toward, our society is oriented toward what he'd call left, if his thesis is correct and is the evidence he's mounted is unbelievable, around kind of left brain dominance, which has got to do with apprehending versus comprehending, which also my part of what apprehension is like this kind of there's a when it comes to interpreting something that we read is very literal. So when you think about this, I was only thinking about this recently in relation after you had told me about your aunt, because something my girlfriend pointed out to me that never occurred to me was that she knows quite a few, she's met in her life quite a few nuns like that, but I've never met any priests that talk like that.
No, yeah.
And she made a point that like you can go to monasteries around Ireland, or not monasteries, weren't nunneries. I don't know what you call it.
Convents.
Convent.
Nunneries.
You go to convents around Ireland, and there's nuns there who are very embodied and very in touch with nature, and they're in their beautifully maintained gardens. There's a very different feel to the way that they talk about Catholicism than you hear typically at a Sunday morning mass or at a funeral or at a wedding. That's given by a priest, where it's maybe that's just a selection bias. Maybe there's just a selection bias in there, but I can't help but think that there's a kind of a lot of Catholicism that maybe we were brought up in was very kind of detached and literalist. It was very kind of detached and literally patriarchal, and very much the emphasis was almost on this entity that operates outside of nature with a kind of a naughty or nice list that's watching everything like an observer.
Yeah.
You know? And that kind of thing is just really hard to it's really hard to it's hard to buy into or to grasp. Whereas the notion, if you look at it the other way around, that whatever God or nature, or in Spinozan language, he do like God, nature, substance to describe the same thing. Whatever that source is, I like the word source because it's not weighted to the same extent. That it's not on us. It's not on us to do something such that we are doing what some external observer wants us to do. It's that it's on us to live in alignment with this source, let's say. And or to live in alignment with, like in Stoicism, they'd have this notion of the logos, or the way of nature. That you're living in alignment with the way of nature. And that kind of sentiment is much more like you had described your aunt as kind of describing, because the notion that there's just this anthropomorphized figure that's operating outside of nature and cares whether two men love each other or care, you know, it's like that's just untenable. So when you were asking earlier on, like about whether Christianity is dead, and that's where it comes down to, and that kind of like, it's so cliche now for those of us that have listened to a lot of Jordan Peterson, but I think he's really is onto something when he's like, well, what do you mean by Christianity? What do you mean by God? What do you mean by religion? Because those terms that we have in Ireland have grown up with in the West, but speaking from Ireland, from both of us having grown up here, those terms are so weighted with a load of assumptions and presumptions, and there's axioms in there in our understandings of those words that aren't necessarily aligned with the kind of thing that, because when you hear about mystical, so there's a field of neuroscience called neurotheology, and it was set up by this guy called Andrew Newberg, I believe, who's basically, what he's doing is studying the neuroscientific bases, or the neuroscientific correlates, or the neuroscience basically of religious experience. And when you read stuff that you read research that they've done on Franciscan nuns who can chant themselves into a trance, on Buddhist meditation practitioners, on Sufi mystics or Sufi Islamic practitioners that can essentially like dance and kind of like sing their way into trances. And then you look at even psychedelic research from like Imperial College in London, and you see that the descriptions of these mystical states are really similar across these different religions, and from people who have breakthrough experiences on psilocybin in controlled psychedelic psychotherapy settings in Imperial College London and in Johns Hopkins Medical School and other places around that there's like they're describing what sounds like the same place. You know, in terms of this, the kind of thing that I've talked about before, in terms of this This sense of like loss of first person coordinates, an experiential union with all of nature, even psychedelic psychotherapy patients that are inside or subjects that are in these studies that are inside in rooms that are just like a room in a research building, are experiencing unification with all of nature and then feeling at one with all of nature, and this kind of being awash and totally engulfed by unconditional love. And these are the kind of states that you feel like. I was forced after my particular experience, I was afterwards to try and grasp at some way of describing it. And I was forced to kind of claw at religious language, because there wasn't anything that got across the point of what it was like to feel unconditional acceptance by something, and at the same time to feel total union with it and a total loss of all first person coordinates, and with infinite love that went on forever in every direction. And that kind of experience sounds so hippy dippy, and it sounds so new agey, and it sounds so cliche, but it's what religious mystics have been talking about as long as they've been writing stuff down. It's the kind of thing that St. Francis of Assisi was implied that he was after experiencing, or modern day mystics and practitioners across loads of domains and these psychedelics. So it's like, I don't know where I was kind of going with that, but it's almost like Tolstoy described religion as along the lines of how a person reconciles the finite with the infinite.
Infinite, yeah.
So like, and if you think about what's the infinite, well, the infinite is either literally infinite in terms of because infinite could be all that there is, or it could be what goes on forever. It doesn't really matter. Like, all that there is and what goes on forever is basically might as well be the same thing. Because if the word infinite either has an edge, or because this is a kind of an interesting thing with maths or physics, that the infinite can have an edge actually, but it's describing all that there is in one kind of way I've heard it talk. But anyway, so let's say it is infinite and it's just all that there is. It's the source. It's like, how does one reconcile one's finite existence with all that there is, with existence itself? And that's kind of religion. And his notion of, or his approach to doing it, and basically how he didn't end up killing himself, was through trying to imitate Christ in this very stripped down, non-institutional version of Christianity that removed all of what he kind of saw as superstition and what he all kind of saw as kind of, in his word, nonsense. He used the word a number of times in that collection of essays called that Confession. And to him, there was this notion of like this supreme law of love, that love is the way through which God, or in our case, Spinozan case, nature or source, operates through humanity. So it's like that's the source of existence expressing itself through humanity is through love. It's that kind of a sentiment.
That's interesting, Ciaran, because I just want to pick on this point for a minute, because you spoke about your experience about infinite love in all directions. Then you speak about Tolstoy saying about love. Then Tolstoy influences Gandhi. Gandhi influences Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King influences, obviously, the civil rights movements in America, which go on in turn to influence the civil rights movements in Ireland, which go on then to basically influence how we were brought up. So the echo of that knowledge and this kind of, collective consciousness, to use Jung's words, and this kind of, domino effect of knowledge into society, like how powerful that is. And that's from, it could be argued, Tolstoy finding God in a Christian society somewhat stripped back. Now, did he create his own religion within Christianity? Possibly, potentially, maybe he did. Yes, he did. And then he created that, and that's what happened from that. So it's interesting that you used the word love. And then we both read Martin Luther King Jr.'s book recently, On love.
What was it called? A tender heart and a tough mind and a tender heart.
Yeah, I think that's what it was called. I can't remember.
Tender
It's
heart.
up there in the bookshelf. It's a small little book. It was nice. I bet heaps of notes in it. But that was really, I just kept, when people said to me, what's that book? I said, it's Martin Luther talking about love. That's all it's about. Like, that's really what it was about love and kindness, which is very Buddhist as well. You go into the Theravada Buddhist system, they talk about love and kindness meditation. There was so much stuff about it. And interesting enough, I had an appointment with my gastroenterologist after having a colonoscopy a few weeks after it. And I was reading that book in the waiting room, and he was like, oh, come on in. So I came on in, and then guess what you're reading? I said, oh, this book by Martin Luther King. He goes, oh, can I have a look at it? And I went, yeah. So he was flicking through it, and he goes, you're not just reading this, you're actually reading this, because there was all notes in it, it was all dog-eared notes in it. And so he was like, I'm going to get a copy of this, so it's interesting how, like, it affects people and it rolls on, and the echoes and the impact it can have. And I would argue back as well that you talk about this unification. It's interesting that the word Catholicism or Catholic means universal.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting. You start seeing all these kind of dots.
Yeah, it comes from the Greek, like Katholikos, which means universal. I only learned that recently myself.
Yeah.
Katholikos. So
it's very interesting. And on the same topic then, if we talk about this, just throw another kind of a bit into the mix, the old psychiatrist, psychologist, our old favorite friend, Carl Jung, he actually said that Catholicism and this approach towards, let's say religion, love, spirituality, that the Catholic Church is probably the most sane way to go about it compared to all the other religions. Yeah. Now, that wouldn't sit well with a lot of people today. And I've been grappling with this. And obviously, we're going to have Shane Credo coming on the podcast in a few weeks, who's a psychiatrist. We're going to be talking about more like his personal experiences, because he's a devout Catholic. And I think this is interesting because we have to separate the religion or the philosophy or the acts behind it. And then you need to really, like, not only tease, but fucking drag apart the atrocities that's happened in the Catholic Church. Burning people at the stake, rape, the treatment of unmarried mothers, the treatment of kids, the abuse, all of that stuff needs to be really decoupled. And it's hard to do that. And I'm sure, Ciaran, and I definitely know of people who have, had their lives impacted and multi-generations impacted by the negative aspect of the people within the church, not the religion itself. And so to me, I'm being reflected on this. I see a lot of commonalities with Marxism, or communism, probably should be the technical word.
There's like the institution of bureaucratic power kind of a thing.
Exactly, yeah, because it looks great on paper and it looks like it could be a perfect utopian system. And then we put people into it and we go, whoa. And that's what, for me, that's what pushes me back away from being part of a church, is that behavior. And that's why I like probably like Tolstoy or Buddhism, Spinoza. It's very much left to you. And some people might argue, well, you're just creating your own religion within it. But my counter argument to that will be, if God is nature and nature is God, doesn't matter what way I live in the principles. Why do I have to go to a house or a temple or through some other appointed being to be part of God? So yeah, bit of a ramble there for me, but there's lots of kind of sticky points there on the ground that I'm seeing, and maybe I'm drawing lines between them that don't make any sense, or maybe there is some between them. I'm not really sure.
But I think I've been thinking a good bit about what you were saying as well about the, particularly in Catholicism, because we grew up in this society that was riddled with, like, when I was a kid in the 90s, I remember distinct memories of like getting ready for school in the morning for primary school in the early 2000s, getting ready for secondary school in the morning, and hearing the radio, like in Morning Ireland or whatever that was on at the time, and hearing about the latest child sex abuse scandal, the latest unveiling of the institution of the Catholic Church in Ireland moving and a sex abusing priest from parish to parish rather than take him out of the parish, that the institution was like moving pedophiles around rather than have them subject to any kind of accountability for raping kids. And that's the kind of, and then revelations about the Magdalene laundries and not even maybe just revelations that were public, but even like a public willingness to point to what they knew was already going on. You know, because there was so much power that the Catholic Church had, but it's again, as you said, there's a fascinating that it's the institution and the bureaucracy, and there's that notion of like power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. You know, that old Lord Acton quote. And there is that reality to the human. That's where bureaucracies and institutions can go wrong. But particularly when if you have this notion where you have a belief system where there's these representatives that are intermediaries between you and the creator of the universe.
Yeah.
And they say something, then the likelihood of pushing back against them is much lower than if it's as if then there's a regular Joe Soap, you know? So like there's something about that it's easy to see how it happens, where people are less likely to be skeptical or less likely to push back, or if they feel like if this person who's like the representative of the creator of the universe in your parish has power over the parish and the population, and you know that there's some fishy stuff going on, but then you're afraid to push back against it or speak out against it because you could get excommunicated, or you could get unofficially marginalized within the community because this person has so much power. You know, like that there's really dark side of the use of power and influence for one's own benefit. That it's not just it just so happens that in this case it was the Catholic way of doing it, but there was, you know, this is an interesting thing though, in that you mentioned Martin Luther King, and it relates to the kind of the Catholic stuff, is that what's fascinating though is the criteria by which we're judging them is in itself a Christian criteria. So for example, Martin Luther King was massively influenced, obviously, by he was a Christian pastor himself. I think he might have been Lutheran. I'm not sure what kind of Christianity he was, Protestant, but
I believe
and obviously influenced by Tolstoy, but the means by which we judge whether the civil rights movement by King in the US was a good thing was because we're viewing it through a Christian lens. Whereas like if Martin Luther King was alive today or equivalent, except he appeared in China, modern China, and started speaking out publicly against the oppression of, let's say,
the Uyghurs.
Let's say it was Christians, or the suppression of the church, or obviously if it was like a Uyghur Muslim equivalent of Martin Luther King, who in terms of like being a civil rights advocate, that fella's getting disappeared. Like he's getting, like Gandhi was only able to do what he was able to do because it was the British Empire that he was speaking out against. So like Gandhi, if there was if it was the Ottomans or something that were in India, and Gandhi rocked up and said, look, we're going to do peaceful protests or whatever, they're all just going to be killed. They're just going to be slain. It was because it was a Christian liberal democracy. That's why Gandhi's peaceful protests were able to actually work. And the same thing in the US with Martin Luther King. Like loads of fucked up things happened to protesters who protested peacefully, influenced by Martin Luther King. They're beaten up by cops and racists and all this kind of stuff happened. But the criterion by which we are able to say that shouldn't have happened is that's because we're viewing it from a Christian lens itself. So this is something that like Tom Holland talks about, is like even the criterion by which we see rape and murder and oppression as being bad things is because we're saturated in a culture that sees something intrinsically worthy about a victim. You know, the fact that we see that there's someone who's being oppressed or being persecuted by someone who's more powerful, and we see that as a bad thing. Like that sentiment didn't exist in what is now the West prior to Christianity. Like, and you look at the treatment of, like, You have people like like I think it was one part in Dominion that's particularly fucking horrific, where there was the Assyrians who were killing Jews by putting hooks up through their eyes into their head and hanging them from things. You know, the means of torture, the way that the Romans eventually went on to persecute Christians, like putting them on iron chairs that were heated with fires underneath it and cooking people to death, feeding them to animals, obviously crucifying people, which is what he actually opens the book with, is descriptions of crucifixions. And it was a slave's death. It was the most kind of like horrific way that they could basically illustrate disobedience, is like by putting, this person was a disobedient slave or they did something wrong, let's nail them to a stick outside the walls there down the road, and they're going to die a slow, painful death in the sun while the birds eat his eyeballs. Like that was that element of ability to, like, when you have a whole religious, not at the time it wouldn't have even been religious, it was like this way of thinking about the gods as if the gods only admired strength and power and beauty only. That the idea of valorizing the weak, the oppressed, the persecuted, of seeing something that could be a form of strength or a source of divinity within the lowest, weakest, most persecuted, most oppressed, that notion that they have just as much worth as the emperor, that's a Christian notion. That's not something we take it for granted. Like if we see a video of a criminal who does something wrong, like let's say something like, we see videos even from America where you see something like someone like George Floyd commits a crime that like uses a fake $20 bill or something, and then he dies under the knee of a cop. The criterion by which we're judging that even to be bad is a Christian criterion in the West. You know, in terms of this formation of like this abuse of power, this inappropriate use of force. Like that's, and whether or not you can say like, and you can trace, I have some thoughts around the kind of that it's not necessarily Christian only, that humans were set up for compassion and empathy and were set up for altruism evolutionarily. So is it that it's a Christian notion, or is it that it's a Christianity, these Christian themes are actually ways of kind of like philosophical and theological ways of unlocking the evolutionary software that we already have, and these orientations that we have toward altruism and these kind of like these reward mechanisms that evolution gave us, where we feel good when we orientate towards the betterment of others, even at our own expense. Like modern altruism research points to that really strongly, and like modern evolutionary psychologists and theorists, like guys like David Sloan Wilson has a quote that I really liked, which is like, he said, selfish individuals outcompete altruistic individuals, but altruistic groups outcompete selfish groups. So, and that's like looking at it evolutionarily, where we're tribal animals are set up to work as groups and take care of each other and take care of women when they're vulnerable, take care of injured people when they can't hunt, or when they get injured, we bring food back anyway and feed them. And those groups that did that would have outcompeted groups that would have, when someone's injured, get rid of them. When someone's sick, get rid of them. And then those groups wouldn't have stayed together to the same, they would have been outcompeted in certain extents. Just to finish the point briefly, in just that the Christian notion of universal love, basically it's like a way of unlocking those inbuilt altruistic tendencies that would have been limited by something like Dunbar's number, which is where we can have meaningful emotional attachments to like 130, 140, 150 people. And it would have just taken the software that was there, that was limited to those who could be closest to, and expanded it out across all of humanity, just so that all people, even those that we don't know, are just as worthy as those that we do, in terms of in relative to the creation of existence, relative to existence itself. So, and so I'll leave it at that. I'm after going on for a while there, but what do you think of any of that stuff?
Yeah, a couple of interesting ones there. You talk about the sort of the Dunbar's number, and we kind of bring these tribes, and obviously that then maybe it's scalable or maybe it's not scalable to society. And maybe what you spoke about there with the tribe, with someone being injured, you can bring them back food. That's like nearly like a mini socialist communist, system in itself. And to try and roll it up then to a societal thing, then so maybe communism, so to speak, or socialism works in 150 or less, and then over that it's fucked really, and then the degree of it's like this crossover, like it's really effective, and then when you hit a certain number of people it just drops off, and then when you hit like X million of people it really fucking drops off, like it becomes counterproductive.
But an example of that could be if you look at modern day attempts to live on Mars, right? If you took 100 people that were sound, and even if they're just 100 people that are engineers or scientists and some medics, and you sent them over there, and there's 100 people, they're not going to need money. They're not going to need means of exchange.
Yeah.
Because everyone's able to track everyone else, and you can track for things like reputation, and you can track for things like social loafing, like whether or not someone is half-arsed in their work and kind of taking advantage of other people's work.
Yeah.
Track that, because there's a few enough of you. And then on top of that, on top of social tracking, then there's also few enough people for you to genuinely have enough interactions of enough frequency and intensity to genuinely start to develop a sense of emotional attachment to their well-being.
Yeah.
Whereas as soon as you had pointed to, you all of a sudden then, if, let's say a few years after that, 10 years after that, you have 5,000 people living on Mars in these domes or whatever the fuck they end up building over there. Now all of a sudden you need money, you need something to facilitate a means of exchange. You need something to facilitate, maybe not money, but something else to be able to facilitate the exchange of goods and services. Because otherwise you end up with the centralized power that's able to control the goods and services. They now have complete control of the society. And if a tyrannical kind of a person or a despot person ends up getting the reins of control for the food storage, they're now king Martian, and get a chance to do what every other cult leader does and take everyone's wife or whatever. It's like that.
Yeah.
So like that, you have to decentralize. Part of what capitalism does, one of the benefits of it is the decentralization of power through a decentralized means of good production of goods and services and voluntary exchange. It's just one of the benefits of it, apart from the harnessing of creativity and collective intelligence. That's a benefit to it. There's obviously downsides to it, but one of the benefits is that decentralization of power.
Yeah.
And that that means you don't need to as intensely track for reputation and social loafing, etc. Because if the good works, and it's like, if I buy oranges from this fella, as long as it's fucking oranges, like if it ends up being poisonous oranges, then that's going to harm the reputation. But it's a means of, like, whether this fella was lazy in his orange production, as long as he has the oranges, doesn't matter. So
yeah, this reminds me of a couple of things here, this conversation, these points we're touching on. So one is, I often think about this as like a scale of a visual scale. From down on the left is more extreme left in terms of politics, and then you got extreme right on one side. And as you go down more towards the left, you get more centralized, you get more control. As you go more down towards the left, or down towards the right, it's more decentralized, there's less control. But then at certain points at the far ends of those spectrums, they actually become very controlling in themselves. So it's nearly like the line is straight, but then it wraps around right at the end and bends itself back on itself. To your comment about, Nazi socialism ended up being a version of communism nearly in a different way. Like that sort of extremism at both ends were just as polarizing on each end. But I want to come back to your comment there on Mars and the smaller groups, because I think you're right, because there's other research there. If you think about precursor to Christianity, we obviously had like Greek and Roman philosophy. We had the Stoics, we had Buddhism out before Christianity. and you see lots of Buddhism and Stoic philosophy and these other philosophies in Christianity. So maybe it could be thought that Jesus and this kind of new Christianity is just a new version of philosophy, and it's continually evolving, and it's how we live. So it's constantly learning, and it's a learning. We are learning mammals, and we are basically in a big learning organization. We're taking these things into account, and we're moving on, and we're continually looking for improvement. Now, those small groups and those numbers, it's interesting because you make me think about Adam Grant's work about give and take, about how basically if you give a donation to somebody or you do something for somebody, how good it makes you feel. And so we also know as well from lots of things as well, is that people will never remember what you gave them in terms of a physical thing. Like you might say, if you were married for 20 years, you might remember every birthday present, every Christmas present you got, or every present, but you'll remember how that person made you feel, which is more important, right? So this give and take is very, very important. And I believe in this kind of law of karma. When I do good things for people in terms of donating money or, doing free things at work or helping out people, it's going to come back to me in some other way. So there is a selfish aspect to it as well, but it's coming back to your collective thinking about, well, I'll hope someday that someone will help me, or they'll recommend me for something, or if I'm down, and I need a job, they'll help me out. So I'm trying to think like that. And I think we're designed to do that. This is also similar to what you were talking about there on a capitalist point of view, is Adam Smith, who wrote the book, The Wealth of Nations, back in the 1700s, who was, I don't know if you know Adam Smith. He was probably the very first economist, I think, really would say. So he talks about this invisible hand, which is basically coming back to what you're saying about the Martians. And I think to a certain degree, Ciaran, we could replicate that on the planet, because if you look at people working in Antarctica, a lot of the pre-mission research from Mars gets done with people in Antarctica. So I know some researchers that do like sleep and circadian rhythm research. They look at loneliness and isolation, because they go to Antarctica for like 6 months, whatever it might be. And it provides this unique opportunity. And I would dare say that in Antarctica, money and power probably wouldn't be the biggest things, but you're in this extreme environment, and you do have to be able to look after one another. You do have to care for each other, and you all have to pull your weight in that sort of environment as well. So we could potentially look at how that would be impacted on Earth to some degree, and replicate those conditions. So, and then the commodity or the wealth of nations, that's sort of the invisible hand. What becomes more of a commodity, we'll say, to trade in that respect? Is it someone that looks after people, helps everybody out, or is it the malingerer that never does his work every day on the digger, and just rings in sick like 4 days out of 7, and he's in Antarctica and he knows he can't be kicked off the job anyway because it's too costly to get him out there? So these are the kind of things that are floating around when you're talking there about that. But I do think that, this inherent, I would say nearly inherent socialism is in us. And it's in us it is altruistic, but it's also in us for survival, because if we don't look after each other, nobody will look after us. And it's very much this kind of circular type of thinking. But in saying that,
what's fascinating though is that it ends up being rewarding for its own sake, in terms of like, as well. So it's like it ends up being, what way have I thought of it, that notion of like, that it ends up being of use for group survival, but also it feels like for example, like Christmas presents, you mentioned there about gifts, right? Like, it feels better to give gifts than to get them. That's unless you're a young child and you're super excited about Santa coming down the chimney or whatever, it feels unreal. It feels so nice to give gifts, and it always feels better to give than it is to get those gifts. And in that kind of scenario, it's a win-win, because we have these reward, these altruistic kind of reward mechanisms that make us feel good when we orientate toward the betterment of others at our own expense. And a gift particularly feels good if we've put time and effort into it, or it's cost us some kind of sacrifice. It even feels even better. It could be expensive, of course, but it could also just be a lot of thought, or it could be a really carefully worded note on the inside of a book that we put some time into thinking about and writing, or, it's like, and I think in that it's what would have been useful evolutionarily, but also there's something about it that, again, I think it's that software that gets unlocked with this notion of philosophically or theologically orientating toward all humans being equal in the eyes of source, or not in the eyes, but all being relative to the source of existence. And let's say, to use non-religious language, but that when you have these, when you actually expand it out and you look at these mystical states that people report from, whether it be through psychedelics or religious experience, the sense of unconditional love that people have for all other people, it's like it's possible to see then where that, like, you extend it out, where the roots of these religions lie in these mystics. Like you're not going to rationally tell someone with no grounding that, you know what we're going to do, we're all going to orientate towards the betterment of everyone else, even though they're not in your tribe and they're not in your ethnicity and you don't look like them and you don't know them and you'll never know them, but we're going to do it anyway. Why? Because we're just going to do it. So that kind of thing doesn't work. Like, you have to anchor it to story and proposition. But then even where the source of the impulse to even do that comes from, I think there's probably like strong arguments that it's coming from mystical experiences, coming from experiences of mystical unio, you know, with in this unconditional love, this that they're the roots of it. They're like, maybe the likes of Jesus and Buddha and Muhammad had these similar experiences. You know, this kind of whole notion of, Aldous Huxley had this notion of the perennial philosophy, that maybe there was the same experience at the bottom of their in their consciousness, the same consciousness, but then their way of talking about it, their way of trying to articulate their implications of their experience to those around them, was then filtered through their particular cultural upbringing and the tools that they had, the linguistic, conceptual, metaphorical tools that they had to work with, the cultural constraints of their environment, the environmental constraints, the cultural constraints, that stuff influenced how it was that they went about trying to impart the lessons that were taken from this mystical experience. You know, and then there's kind of hypothesizing, but when you look at the stuff that's being reported from the psychedelic studies, and also from neurotheology, and also from reports of mystical experience across religious traditions, I think there's a really strong argument that can be made for that, because there's such a similarity across all these different traditions.
Yeah, that's like, is it German Allegro's work about the sacred mushroom and the cross, for example? You know, these tangling of sort of psychedelics and religion together. And then you've got your man that you spoke about earlier on. What's his name?
Brian Muraresku.
Yeah, I can never pronounce his name because it's like 20 million syllables in it. He wrote that book on psychedelics, and he's been on, I think, Peterson's podcast and Rogan's podcast with Graham Hancock. That's fascinating, like how psychedelics has been intertwined in our life as well. So,
but the thing is, the fascinating thing is that it doesn't necessarily even just have to be psychedelics, because you can get people can end up in psychedelic states. Obviously, we know from meditation, from breath work, from fasting, from prolonged darkness immersion, just from being in a fucking dark room for days on end. And then people are reporting, like, there's actual darkness retreats. Like,
I've heard of them,
last year, last year, and a couple of times actually, particular podcast where this guy went to the Black Forest, poetically enough, in Germany.
Is that your man, Marcus? Yeah, I listened to that podcast when he was talking about,
it was fun. And he'd done a load of psychedelics. He's done all of them, basically. And he said that this is the most psychedelic thing he ever did, was spend 7 days in a dark room with no light ever at all at any point. And so when you see that, whether or not, because Muraresku makes a really strong case in that book, The Immortality Key, a big quote I have from him, I have kind of prepared for this podcast, but he makes a load of, knits together all these different disciplines. You know, he reads ancient Greek, he reads Latin, he reads other languages as well. He was able to stitch together this evidence from records from the time, from modern archaeochemistry, where they look at like substances that were found in Sidon containers and vessels. Like when you look at the fact that something like LSD grows from a fungus that can come from fermenting plants, ergot, like LSD comes from ergot, that you're like, this versions of LSD is not going to be hard to see how that can come about and how that can be harnessed. And if that stuff is what was involved in something like the Eleusinian mysteries in ancient Greece, if it was something like it was involved, which there's a lot of strong evidence that it was, or something like that, this stuff called koukion, if it was potentially what was involved in, when you read the modern reports, like I mentioned a few times, from Johns Hopkins and Imperial College, these other universities, these people that are experiencing this loss of sense of self and union with all of reality and are forced to kind of claw at religious language to try and describe what they experienced. It's not hard to see how, if you had a way, using psilocybin mushrooms, which is just there's a form of DMT, if you have a way of getting a group of people in and giving them that, and everyone's experiencing this love and these visions and this loss of self and this union with nature and union with other people, that strikes me as a particularly useful way of facilitating a religious structure, you know, in terms of a communal religious structure. And he uses the example, Muraresku makes the case in that book that that what we now would use as he hypothesizes that what we now think of as, or call the sacrament we do communion at church, that is a placebo sacrament, and that's basically just a placebo version of what would have been a form of psychedelic, whether some form of mushroom or some form of ergot LSD based kind of substance, ergot derived LSD based substance that would have been at the very roots of Christianity itself. And he uses an example, one particular example is the wedding at Cana, where the whole like water into wine notion, where they're kind of particularly odd description of people getting more drunk after drinking this new special wine, that in itself is actually has Dionysian roots. And Dionysus, being the Greek god, would have been the kind of the god of ecstasy and dance and kind of like primal kind of like in antithesis to Apollo, and which is like more rational, orderly, etc. And it just is really strong cases there. But like I have a quote from him there. But before I get on that, there's one particularly thing that I think you might find interesting, and I hear what you think about this. So like you might not have gotten to this part of the book yet, but I have some notes here from something that I'm writing, specifically got to do with Tolstoy and these other religions, like you had mentioned.
Yeah.
So later on in the book, I think it's one of the essays called "The Law of Love and the Law of Violence" is the one that this is from.
I haven't got there yet. Yeah.
So this is about Tolstoy's Christianity, and it was like you had said about potentially is Christianity just a more refined version. This is what Tolstoy was getting to. So this is what I wrote. What he was not, however, was an adherent to any church of Christianity that already existed. He was a follower of Christ insofar as he tried to follow his example regarding how to live, rather than accept the dogma or follow the directions of any institutional Christianity, which he saw as rife with inherent contradictions and, quote, nonsense. In The Law of Love and the Law of Violence, Tolstoy describes what he found specifically in Christianity, which he could not find elsewhere. Quote, compared to all the ancient teachings, Christianity is neither new nor different. It is simply a more clear and precise expression of the basis of human life that was felt and vaguely expounded by previous religions. And thus, the Christian teaching on love is not, as in former doctrines, merely a teaching about a certain value, but it is a definition of the supreme law of human life and the guidance for conduct that inevitably follows from it. Close quote. Hence, while teachers from other ancient religions he mentioned, such as Buddhists, Taoists, Stoics, or Brahmins, thought of love not as but one virtue, or as but one virtue. Sorry, I haven't edited this yet, so it's a bit clunky. He saw the Christian religious foundations that placed love on a pedestal of supreme virtue above all else. For him, it was the guidance for love to be, quote, applied equally to enemies and those who hate, offend and curse us, that constitutes the particular peculiarity of Christ's teaching.
Now, Ciaran, my first and initial reaction to that is, doesn't that really summarize lots of what we spoke about today?
Yeah.
It really does. Like, we spoke about, you know, the evolution of Christianity in terms of like Stoic philosophy going into it, or karmic law, or whatever it might be, Spinoza, nature. You know, it's basically, we've discussed many of those elements there that Tolstoy has just outlined, you know. So it's kind of, it's interesting because, and also he's obviously grappling there with the separation between, you know, the religion itself and Christianity and the people involved in it, which we spoke about there as well in the context of Ireland. So even him as a Russian some 150 years ago is having that same thing, basically, that people, you know, corrupt these systems and screw it up, so to speak. So he's grappling with the 150 years ago the same problems that we're grappling with today. And it's those type of things that make me now want to go to a church, you know, because of that. I think if church was like these conversations, I'd be there every morning.
What's fascinating though, and I've been thinking about this a bit now, especially with Tom Holland's book, and also just looking at the amount of, so this is something that actually I'm going to be end up grappling with and wrestling with around Tolstoy and his advocations for pacifism, total pacifism. You know, because we talked obviously about Ukrainian war and violence, and, you know, and let me put it this way, right? If the barbarians show up at the gates and you're unwilling to defend yourself, you get rolled up and wiped out.
Yeah.
So, like an example, like in relatively recent history, was when the Spanish and the Europeans showed up in America, North America. The Native Americans that were wiped out first were the more peaceful, farmer, agricultural based Native Americans who were less violent, less warlike, just did a bit of farming, weren't as organized militarily. They got wiped out almost immediately because the Spanish or the Europeans just rock up and kill them and take their shit. Whereas the Apaches, Comanches, Sioux, these ones that were like roaming herd-like warrior cultures, that their foundation of their culture was war and this roaming, taking over of territory or moving of territory in response to tribes, in response to war. They lasted like 300-400 years after the European invaders basically showed up in North America. So like, there's a reality, and eventually they get wiped out, but there's a reality to this notion of power and institutions where perhaps if there wasn't an institutional bureaucratic power structure that had its inherent flaws and its inherent corruption and its inherent kind of poisoning and darkening by human shadow and by psychopathy and by people vying for power within this structure, so that for their own ends, pretending to be doing so on behalf of their religion and manipulating religious teachings to justify acts of barbarism or war or thievery or whatever. Perhaps the Christianity wouldn't exist at the moment. Perhaps it would have been wiped out. Perhaps it wouldn't have survived. You know, like it would have been persecuted out of existence. You know, just like for example, like even in recent years, the communists, you know, almost drove Russian Orthodoxy to extinction.
Yeah.
You know, so it's like, this is something that that's occurred to me, in that like the fact that the Catholic Church, it's been so, there's so many easy to reference examples of corruption, barbarism, what would you call it when someone is like hypocrisy. There's a lot of stuff we talked about around violence and child molestation and hiding rapists and all this kind of stuff. But that at the same time, perfection doesn't exist, and perfection on earth is impossible, because if the human condition is so messy, and it's still what I'm finding interesting is like coming more and more around to the notion that the positives might still out, in spite of all of that there still could have been way more good done than harm, because of the preservation, the fact that there was such a powerful structure facilitated the preservation of this inherently revolutionary message, this notion of like everyone's equal, love your brother, and sister would have been some of the original Christian stuff, which is fascinating as well. It's maybe another discussion for another day, but like something that Muraresku talks about is the original Christian teachings, Christian practices were actually ceremonies that were ran by women, not men. And that the Gospel of John that specifically references Jesus coming back and telling, was it Peter, to run his church, that was added in afterwards, and that the original Gospel of John, the last person that Jesus talked to, which is when he came back after the resurrection, was Mary Magdalene and the women, and not any men. And that the bit about adding in, telling men to run the church was added in later, after the original gospel. It's something that Muraresku talks about, and because he's referencing other sources on that. And that the potential structures even that are patriarchal were like the Roman influence on the development of the church, and not necessarily the original Christian influence. So that's a different kind of a topic for another day, I suppose. But like, so this is what's fascinating, is like that it's such an inherently revolutionary message. You know, this notion, and it's what's fascinating as well as a kind of paradox. It'd be fascinating to hear what Shane thinks of this, because like what Tolstoy is getting at here, Tolstoy himself derives from his readings of Christianity an inherently sort of anarchist and anti-institutional sentiment, which is you have a fella who's preaching universal love and gets nailed to a stick by a giant bureaucratic imperialist power. And what he's basically doing is saying the last will be first and the first will be last, and pointing out that this notion of a hierarchy of importance amongst people, it's not reflective of their intrinsic worth. And that in itself is almost that's sowing the seeds for revolution within its own structure. Like within the Catholic Church is this inherent seed that's like, it's the roots of it itself are inherently anti-institutional, which is a fascinating kind of paradox for this giant bureaucracy that spans the globe and has been going on now for 1600 years or whatever, the actual institutions, you know, of the Catholic Church, or whenever it began officially as a big institution, you know, after the Council of Nicaea and trying to formulate what's the actual official Christian creed, that at its core is an inherently revolutionary anti-institutional sentiment, which is like the anti-hierarchical power. So it's like I'd love to actually chat, because these are just thoughts that are coming to me of late. So but they're still kind of raw and loose, and I'd love to hear what, you know, speak to actual Catholics about. Like Shane is going to be a great one, I suppose, to figure out what to make of that inherent, I suppose, contradiction. Because I find it fascinating, and again, I'm just particularly influenced by having read that Tolstoy book recently. So,
no, I think you raised some interesting points there again, Ciaran. I think you talk about you remind me again of Sandy Stoddart, who a very interesting sculptor from Scotland, who, you know, basically when he was talking about Jesus, he says, you know, Jesus is like, you know, it's reminiscent of what happens to very to many very good people in this world, he says, to get nailed to a bit of timber for doing the right thing. And I thought about that and I laughed, and obviously, and he laughed, and it's a very funny kind of analogy or very funny, interpretation of it. But when you think about it, it's true, Ciaran. You think about how many people in their workplace or in school or in life or in a group try and do the right thing, and next minute they get absolutely pasted to the wall. We saw this during COVID as well. People that spoke out, people that said anything, and the whole sort of institution jumped down their neck. If you look at Christ, he was a revolutionary, like you said. And, it's interesting that the Catholic Church then became this whole institution around it after it was inherently based upon a revolutionary idea. It'd be nearly like, having Che Guevara and then having, some sort of Cuban communistic institution that was spanned the world. And then it's basically becoming something that it was basically against at the start, because I don't think Christ was going out there trying to make a pyramid scheme and trying to sell Christianity to lots of people. Not that I know of anyone, unless he was the very first telemarketer that we don't even know about. But he said, wherever two or more are gathered in my name, he didn't say wherever there is a system where you report to priests, bishops, and there's a chain of command. But I think it's like everything, Ciaran. It's like we in society, in our history and across society, there's time for revolution and there's time for peace. And then we also have revolutions, we have peace, and then we have tyrannical forces that come along, and then it takes more revolution. And we've probably seen that over the last few years as well. It's very interesting. And I don't want to talk ad nauseum about COVID anymore because I've fucking had enough of it. But it's interesting to watch people now, 2 years on, completely backflip on their policies 2 years ago, where people were evangelical about, let's do what the government says. Everybody get vaccinated. Everybody do this, blah, blah, blah. Protect yourself, protect yourself. Wear 10 masks, get 4 jabs, do this, do that. Lock down. And now they're going, oh, fuck this. I'm not doing this anymore. So they went from basically being really compliant in an institutional organization, a big reliance on the government, a big reliance on this now new higher power, to now basically like, we're not doing that. I like, some people are like, I'm fucking done. I'm not getting no more jabs. No, we're no more masks. I've had COVID twice and it's all a lot of shit now. So I'm moving on. Right. And by the way, I didn't die. I'm not over 90. I'm 35 and I'm healthy, So people have started to kind of go, oh, this is what's happening. So it's nearly like what I would call a medical awakening for some, a spiritual awakening for others, but a medical awakening for some where they've gone, oh, in actual fact, this is all shit. Like some people have said to me, did you know that vaccinations actually don't stop you getting COVID? I'm like, yeah, I said that a year and a half ago and people wanted to fucking shoot me in the head. So, but please tell me, so it's kind of funny, in some ways, but or that
lockdowns might have a negative impact on kids and those who are more.
Yeah. And look at all I remember
as if that's a revelation. Now it's coming out.
Exactly.
It's like the Great Barrington Declaration was published in October 2020.
Yeah.
That was saying that exact same thing that then got suppressed by big tech and Google and Facebook, and they got called fringe scientists by the heads of the NIH, even though there was like Harvard,
Stanford,
was it Yale,
Stanford,
Oxford, and Stanford. Epidemiologists, and they were called fringe epidemiologists. But sure, how could anyone know what the consensus was if you were marginalized for raising dissent? How could you can't know what consensus is if heterodoxy gets punished?
Exactly,
because people aren't voicing their opinion.
But therefore, there isn't a consensus, and this was the same as well about financial stuff that was basically foreseen. Inflation rates, global supply chain issues. This was all said probably about a year ago, and people buried their head up their ass, and now they're wondering why petrol is double the price and why stuff has gone up 10 to 15% and interest rates are rising. And I'm just like sitting here going, look, I'm not the oracle and I'm not out there looking for trends the whole time, but even I was aware of that. So but don't be so surprised.
But this is actually a notion that this relates something actually that's got to do with Christianity. That's something that Nietzsche writes about in that book, actually, The Genealogy of Morals, towards the end, is he writes about the fact that the Christian emphasis on the value of truth eventually turned back in on top of itself and undermined itself, because because then it facilitated it facilitated what became science, and undermined itself in terms of that this notion that, for example, if they started like anchoring to literal interpretations of the Bible, that the world was created X amount of years ago, like 5,000 or whatever, and that the earth goes around the sun and not the other way, and then all of a sudden we can actually this emphasis on truth then ends up facilitating the birth or facilitating the instantiation of what became modern science. Obviously, the word science has been around for a long time, and Aristotle 300 or 400 years before Christ was doing versions of science and so on, and you go back, but it ended up tearing itself apart because this focus on truth was able to become culturally really important, such that it then undermined the propositions that were easily falsifiable by scientific methodologies, like the fact that it's us going around the sun and not the other way around, or that the world isn't flat, or that whatever it's not fucking 5,000 years old. So I was just thinking about it there when we were talking about COVID. It's something that I meant to bring up, and something else though that we didn't, that I think would be an interesting point is this notion of human rights, because so much of, like, we can look at modern discourse around social justice activism. That's essentially, like, there was that notion in the Bible, I can't remember what it was like Mark or Matthew 2016 or something, I can't remember which one it was, 2024 or something, but it was like this notion of the first will be last and last will be first. And what that's kind of pointing to is like this, like, Christ died a criminal's death in the most dehumanizing and punitive way that the Romans had, which was, whip you and then nail you to a stick and then have you die slowly in public. Like, that notion of the first will be last and last will be first is this kind of idea that all people at every level of society have the same intrinsic worth. But how that's been weaponized recently is when you strip out the possibility for love and the possibility for, and also it's this notion, part of it has got to do with the fact that suffering can bring someone closer to God. Whereas the previous way of viewing getting close to the gods was winning a battle, winning a war, dominating your opponent, being more aligned with, like, Mars in Rome, like the god of war, and
Ares,
power and strength and like muscles and fucking swords and bloodshed, and or like this kind of Viking notion of going to Valhalla, this kind of crap, that kind of sentiment. And because you fucking were victorious in battle, you died a good death in battle. And whereas the Christian notion was like, well, Jesus died and was able to die while still loving his enemy. So Jesus was able to be persecuted and still find a way of loving those, when he says in the cross, Father, please forgive them, for they know not what they do. That's flipping the notion of divinity onto its head. And it's so fascinating, but that's now so imbibed in our culture that when you couple that sentiment with the removal of the love, the removal of the forgiveness, the removal of the possibility for redemption, you end up with what we now have is this woke cancel culture crap.
Exactly, Ciaran. Beautifully said. I think you've drawn that perfect there. That's exactly what's going on. It's exactly what's going on. That's so true.
Fascinating though is that the roots of it are in like there's like the bottom of it is like, okay, we're all for social justice, but what does justice even mean if you're not talking about the sanctity of the individual? So, like, how can we even say, like, why should people who are dominant in a country, like, why is it even wrong if the Chinese government put Uyghurs in concentration camps and harvest organs from Uyghurs in Falun Gong as if they're like livestock that they can do what they want with? Why is that wrong? Like, if they have all the power and they have the will to do so, why is it wrong if they do that stuff? Like, the only way we even think of that as wrong in like any kind of a universally moral sense is because of the Christian sentiment. Because prior to Christianity, in what is now the West, again, maybe you could look at stuff from Buddhism that would have that I know fuck all about, and maybe we get Buddha back on, because I to talk more specifically about Buddhism, which could be really interesting, and him having growing up in a Catholic society and what differences and everything he sees, and what he sees that Buddhism is different to Christianity. It'd be fascinating to actually talk to him about this now that we're going more down this rabbit hole. But I think yeah, it's like the more I'm actually learning about it, the more I'm realizing how much of my worldview that I had totally taken for granted. And even this stuff around human rights and this notion of humans, that there is that humans can have rights, like that in itself is an inherently Christian notion. Like, there's a book I have here that I bought ages ago. It's called The Idea of Human Rights by Michael J. Perry. And there's some really interesting, he's basically making the case that the notion of human rights itself is a deeply religious concept, that you can't use rationality or logic to justify why it is wrong for the Chinese government to harvest organs from Uyghur Muslims and Falun Gong minorities. If they have the power and the will to do it, and they don't give a shit about those people, then why shouldn't they do it? Like, you need to get to a religious level where you're looking at the human condition as inherently reconciled with to use the Tolstoy's language. You have to reconcile the finite to the infinite somehow, in a way that sets the foundation, whether it be through Christianity or whether it be through elements of something like Buddhism that I don't understand, or whatever. Whatever the anchor is that recognizes some kind of universality to the human condition. That's a religious thing, because why the strong shouldn't dominate the weak, that's something that you can't use logic or rationality to justify. That's something that's irrational.
Yeah, I think and again, is it inherently in us, or is it because of our Christian values growing up? Why do we not like the bully? Because if that's the case, we would applaud the bully at school every day. But you don't.
Interesting with the bully, but what's fascinating with the bully though is that even with primates, bring it back to the evolutionary thing, like chimpanzees are known for being really violent relative to something like bonobo, and we're genetically just as related to bonobos as we are to chimpanzees. I believe it's like 98.6% or 98.4% of our DNA is chimpanzee and bonobo, or we share with both, but they're different. So we share just as much genetic material with both of them. But chimpanzees are a lot more violent than bonobos. Bonobos are still a bit violent, but nowhere near as much as chimpanzees. But what's fascinating is even amongst chimpanzees, it's not the most violent, most powerful male that's actually able to be the alpha. Because what happens is 2 or 3 of the subordinates will actually just gang up, or the kind of the weaker ones will gang up and fuck him up and kill him if he's being a bully. So like chimpanzees even need to behave like politicians. And for a chimpanzee to remain in power, he's not the biggest, he's not the strongest or the most violent. He's actually the one who can form coalitions most effectively. And male chimpanzees who want to be the leader or who want to maintain their leadership will actually behave like politicians who want to get elected and go around hugging babies and taking the babies off the females and playing with the baby and stuff, because they want the support of the females. So like they'll actually form coalitions by behaving like our politicians, or our politicians behave like chimps, whatever. So it's like, there's something really interesting in there that bullies, even then, there is something about that, but it's not even just a bully, but imagine a civilization like that just views, like that's what Rome would have done, is Rome was a civilizational bully. That just went out and did what it went on and went on a world tour, like, you know, like that was so. But within those groups, you're gonna have single bullies that eventually get killed. Like you have leaders like Roman emperors who are acting the cunt who get killed by their own lads. That kind of stuff happens, you know.
Was that?
Sorry, you were going to say something there.
I was going to say there on the chimpanzee thing. Is that your man Franz de Waal? Is that him? That was on Peterson recently. I just brought up the podcast here, and
I haven't listened to that now, but I've heard of Franz de Waal before. Actually, a lot of what I know about chimpanzees and bonobos is from people like Chris Ryan, who wrote the book Civilized to Death.
Yeah, I read that years ago. Yeah,
brilliant.
Interesting on Peterson's podcast. I don't know if you've been following the difference. I find that I don't know what's going on. There seems to be like a desynchronization between his podcast on the platform and his YouTube channel. His YouTube channel has way more stuff on it of conversations with people, which are kind of podcasts, but they don't seem to get released as podcasts then for some reason. They're just on YouTube. So I've been following more of Peterson on his YouTube channel as opposed to, you know, like he had that lecture I sent you a few weeks ago or last week, which isn't on his podcast. He interviewed his dad as well this week, which isn't on there either. So there's lots of stuff on there that hasn't sort of made it to the podcast channel, unless there's a delay or whatever it might be. But he had this other conversation actually, DNA difference, 1% apes and humans, Richard Wrangham. That was an interesting one, talking about this as well in terms of the primatology stuff.
I must listen to that.
Yeah, that was on about a month ago. DNA difference is the title of that one. But I've
Richard Wrangham's done a lot of work on violence. I listened to a really good chat between him and Lex Friedman talking about violence.
The
theme of the podcast, yeah, looking at violence in the human condition and our primate violence.
Yeah, so I've got to go back and this other one of the primates as well. I think, did he have that guy France de Waal on his podcast, Peterson, or was it somewhere else? I heard him. I read about that somewhere else. Anyway, getting distracted here, but I think you're dead right in terms of these primate behaviors. Quite interesting, you know, and it is interesting how we as people don't completely, bow down to that bully type culture. I think we've seen that again across many different domains. You see it in a martial arts perspective, Ciaran. I don't know if you see it in boxing, but you definitely see it in jiu-jitsu. If one guy just keeps like beating the shit out of everybody, you know, people don't want to play with him anymore. This is a bit like the rat studies that Peterson and a few others have done as well. You keep beating somebody, at jiu-jitsu or boxing, and you make a bollocks out of them. 1, you're not learning and growing. 2, you're a bully. 3, they're getting nothing out of it, and they don't want to come back. And 4, more importantly, now you won't have any training partners, so nobody wants to play with you. And then you socially isolate yourself, and you just don't want any. So you got to kind of strike that balance between. And I think Peterson said in those studies about the rats, he was saying, I think there was a ratio of 5-1 when rats wrestled. Every 5th or 6th rough and tumble that the rats would have, the bigger rat would allow the smaller rat to get him and push him over. And if you think about that, growing up, like from a male perspective, your uncle or your dad, or your granddad might have been like, oh, you're getting really good at boxing. Oh, you got me. Go, I fell off, whatever. Things like this that would happen as well, to try and create that little bit of like, oh, I'm getting somewhere, I'm moving forward, and to create that. So it's interesting that happens as well. And I think drawing it back to the Christianity thing or the Catholic Church, my feeling of the Catholic Church growing up was constantly you were in the wrong. It was constantly a fear of, you were evil, you were inherently bad, you were not very good. Whereas when you talk about Buddhism, the Dalai Lama, for example, doesn't understand this kind of thing about self-loathing in the West. They don't even have words to describe it, and shame and sort of self-hatred. It's like, why would you even think about that? He is perplexed by this in the West. So, and again, that's the lens through a Tibetan Buddhism framework, whereas in the West, we've got this Christianity one. And I think then you could probably even subdivide it into different countries. Because like I said, the Catholic way, the Catholicism way of doing it was very much, you were always wrong. God was right, the priest was right, but you were always wrong no matter what. It was very much a suppression of ideas. It was very much a suppression of behavior. It was very much a suppression of expression. And so to me, I love the stories of Christianity growing up. I love the stories in the Bible. I love the stories about Jesus going off and doing these wonderful things. He's like a superhero, really, and it should be. We should have Marvel movies about Jesus Christ. It should be the greatest story ever told, volumes 1 to 20, not just once off. This should be like a Marvel Institute, because there's some cool things that happened around it. You got spin-offs then and have 12 episodes on, John the Baptist or Moses and all these things, like we have with Star Wars, but Obi-Wan Kenobi spin-offs and The Mandalorian. We could have all those things. But what's happened is over time, like you were saying, is the institutions got so big and it suppresses so much, it squeezed the good out of it. Like it really squeezed the good out of it for me. It squeezed the life and the soul and the goodness out of it. And it's really sad. And I've recently thought about, is there a road to redemption for me in the Catholic Church? You know, I love churches as a building, independent of the people running them. I absolutely love cathedrals and these buildings. I think they're magnificent. I love just even sitting in them. Sometimes I go and just sit in an Anglican cathedral here in town. I love it. I absolutely love it. But I just cannot see a path for me back to any sort of Christianity institution at the moment, despite feeling so warm and fuzzy about the teachings and the stuff around it. So, yeah, that's
but
kind
I
of.
wonder how much of that is because of the detachment from its source. Like, so if the source of these teachings is along the lines of these mystical experiences, whether through psychedelics, whether through fasting, whether through prolonged darkness immersion, whether through breath work, all these different ways, if it ends up being something like psychedelics, for example, to bring it back to what we were talking about earlier on, but then over time you end up with the messages that come from those experiences get hollowed out, and then the analogies and the metaphors get taken literally rather than as vehicles to try and impart some kind of knowledge that can't be explicitly described. Then you end up with this kind of increasingly detached and disembodied bureaucracy and like propositional structure that's drifting further and further away from the roots from which it came. You know, it's like it's unmoored itself from its origins.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's become it's drifted so far away from what it once was. Yeah,
and from what started it. So like this is something that Peterson in the Dawkins chat recently that I know you've listened to as well. It's the first time I've ever heard him explicitly, openly say that he's done high dose psychedelics.
Yeah. I was like, whoa! I had to rewind it. I was like, whoa, what did he just say? For the first time ever.
First time, like, I'd never heard him. Yeah, and it doesn't surprise me, given how I've heard him talk about it over the years. Yeah. And I don't know when he did it, but I know he'd done ketamine as an attempt to deal with some of his issues, his health issues. He talked about that somewhere before, but he found it a horrendous experience. But mushrooms, I don't know when he did it. I'd be curious to hear him talk about it more, or to maybe talk to Roland Griffiths again about it. Maybe he's done it since Griffiths. I'm not sure, but I know he's been interested in it for years. I remember listening to his college lectures and he's talking about it. But he, in a podcast that came out last year sometime, maybe called The Four Horsemen of Meaning.
Yeah, but Bishop Barron and John Vervaeke and Jonathan Pageau and him. Yeah, I enjoyed that. Yeah, it was very good. I actually like Bishop Barron. I like him. I like some of his stuff. I do as well. Like, and I
re-listened to it recently because of this area of interest that we're both following. And in it, which I'd forgotten he made a point of saying to Bishop Barron and Pageau, because they were talking about psychedelics, he was like, the church, he really takes, at the time he had never said he'd taken psychedelics that I know of, but he had really takes Muraresku's argument seriously. And this other guy, Gordon Wasson, I think was a guy from Harvard. He takes Muraresku's argument. He had him on the podcast, and he takes his book and his argument super seriously. And maybe part of that was because he himself had been influenced by psychedelics for having to take it, but also he was influenced by the research on psychedelics. Like, it fucking turned him inside out, chatting to Roland Griffiths and reading the research on psychedelics before chatting to Roland Griffiths from Johns Hopkins University. And he rephrased, I think that's the way he phrased it himself, that it turned him inside out. And then I remember him in previous lectures years ago talking about people who have mystical experiences from epileptic fits and from seizures, and that Dostoevsky would have these seizures that would where he described as if it was like these mystical experiences. So he was coming at it from all these different angles. But then in that lecture, in that podcast with the Four Horsemen of Meaning, he says to the lads, he's like, a major thing that the Christian church is going to have to do is come to terms with its psychedelic past. I don't remember that bit, but then Barron and Pageau both were kind of resistant, and it was fascinating to hear them kind of engage with that. And Peterson was very ardent. He was like, it's almost certain that there's psychedelic roots to Christianity as a system. And he was very
ardent. I have to listen to that now again, because I didn't pick up. I was sort of passively listening to it, yourself. Well,
You could probably get it if you go on YouTube. You could probably see the timestamps from when I talked about that. But when it makes so much sense. Like from my own experience of this bizarre mystical state, if you want to use that line of William James language, and then reading these reports from these religious mystics, and then reading reports from modern day, like from Chris Ledeby's book above, and he has a whole collection of trip reports from people who are all pointing at the same thing that sound like people like I'm listening to the audiobook of Michael Pollan's psychedelic book, How to Change Your Mind, right? And in it, for example, this notion of like love your enemy.
Yeah.
There's a lady in it who has a trip report of in her psilocybin trip in a psychedelic psychotherapy session, and might have been in Johns Hopkins. She's talking about visualizing Osama bin Laden and recognizing even in him, the core of him is love, and just grabbing him by the head and smothering him in kisses. Osama bin Laden. And she's like, even in him, there's love at the center.
Yeah, yeah.
And this notion of like, when these are the kind of reports, and this notion of when things like blame and unconditional acceptance and forgiveness for oneself and forgiveness for all other people that have wronged you, the things that people are coming away from psychedelic sessions with, it's like, it's not hard to then see what influenced, if not Jesus himself, then followers who had access to this ancient Greek technology, which was this kukion or forms of mushrooms or whatever, that this stuff has been around for hundreds of years before that, going way back to who knows how long, however long the Temple of Eleusis was functioning, doing their psychedelic ceremonies, and that stuff spread around the Mediterranean basin. Like these rituals did, these access to psychedelics and these technologies, basically, psychotechnologies, spread around and were imbibed throughout the culture. And I actually have okay, so this is a quote from a really good interview where he was pushed a bit in a really useful way between Brian Muraresku, who's that Jesuit lawyer who wrote the
Immortality,
Jesuit Catholic raised, but as a lawyer who wrote the book The Immortality Key about psychedelics, and he did a really good podcast with the Harvard Divinity School and the director of that school, like basically the Harvard Theology department or Theology school. So he said, we know from the literature hundreds of years beforehand that in Elis, for example, in the Western Peloponnese, on the same Epiphany type timeline, January 5th and 6th, the priests would walk into the temple of Dionysus, leave 3 basins of water. The next morning, they'd miraculously be transformed into wine. So this whole water to wine thing was out there. And if it only occurs in John, the big question is why? And there are legitimate scholars out there who say, because John wanted to paint Jesus in the light of Dionysus, present him as the second coming of this pagan god, it's not just Cana. He's talking about the wedding of Cana there in the water to wine. This notion in John 15:1, the notion of the true vine, for example, only occurs in John. The idea of the truth shall set you free, that's, again, Dionysus in 832. That also occurs only in John, another epithet of Dionysus. It's only in John that Jesus is described as being born in the lap of the Father, John 1:18, which is very similar to the way that Dionysus sprung miraculously from the thigh of Zeus, and so on and so on and so on, which I'm not going to bore you with and the audience. But the point being here, if the Dionysian wine was psychedelic, which I know is a big if, I think the more important thing is to show that in this pagan continuity hypothesis is that it's at least plausible that the earliest Christians would have had at very least read the Gospel of John and interpreted that Paleo-Christian Eucharistic wine in some communities as a kind of Dionysian psychedelic wine. And I think there are lots of reasons to believe that. So he's relating again his strong arguments. He has a whole section on it. He actually even has a section called something like the sacred toad or something. A section about these different forms of potential toad venom that were used as psychedelics in the same area.
Yeah, yeah.
Fascinating. I know we've talked about in the past. Yeah, it's a really good book.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to have to get that one now as well. All right, Ciaran, we're going
the audiobook is what I listened to. That's why I don't have any quotes from his book. because it's the audiobook I'd listen to, and it's brilliant. He reads it himself.
Oh, does he? And it's easy
like,
to listen to?
It's so good, man. It's like a combination of the Immortality book is like, it's like a combination of like Indiana Jones meets the Da Vinci Code meets kind of, I don't know, like some 1960s psychedelic,
right? Have to get that
counterculture stuff. It's fascinating. It's brilliant, and it's really thorough, you know. And it's been taken really seriously amongst actual, like, again, the Harvard Divinity School that they themselves are setting up. It's taken so seriously, like they're actually setting up a psychedelic program to teach.
I read that.
The Harvard Divinity School.
Yeah,
you know, so they can actually help to kind of educate religious people from different traditions on psychedelics. You know, so I find it.
I was going to say, I'm going to stop the recording there because I'm out of time. I'm out of credits for today. So we might draw a line under today's episode there, and just hang on a moment, and we'll discuss where to next, maybe.
Can I finish with a quote from Nietzsche?
Oh yeah, please do. Let's finish with a quote. We'll do that from Nietzsche, a good old friend Nietzsche.
Yeah. So this is from the Gay Science, where he announces the death of God. So, the madman. Have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, ran to the marketplace and cried incessantly, I seek God, I seek God. As many of those who do not believe in God were standing around just then, he provoked much laughter. Why, did he get lost? Said one. Did he lose his way like a child? Said another. Or is he hiding? Is he afraid of us? Has he gone on a voyage or emigrated? Thus they yelled and laughed. The madman jumped into their midst and pierced them with his glances. Whither is God? He cried. I shall tell you. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. But how have we done this? How were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What did we do when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it now moving? Whither are we moving now? Away from all suns. Are we not plunging continuously, backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there any up or down left? Are we not straying through infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night and more night coming on all the while? Must not lanterns be lit in the morning? Do we not hear anything yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we not smell anything yet of God's decomposition? Gods too decompose. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we, the murderers of all murderers, comfort ourselves? What was holiest and most powerful of all that the world has owned has bled to death under our knives? Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must not we ourselves become gods simply to be worthy of it? There has never been a greater deed, and whoever will be born after us, for the sake of this deed, he will be part of a higher history than all of history hitherto. Here the madman fell silent and looked again at his listeners, and they too were silent and stared at him in astonishment. At last he threw his lantern on the ground, and it broke and went out. I come too early, he said to them. My time is not come yet. This tremendous event is still on its way, still wandering. It has not yet reached the ears of men. Lightning and thunder require time. The light of the stars requires time. Deeds require time even after they are done, before they can be seen and heard. This deed is still more distant from them than the most distant of stars, and yet they have done it to themselves.
Boom,
That's it.